Welcome, Priya. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
Thank you for having me.
The Art of Gathering. You might think this is a bad time for this book to come out, but it's actually the most important time ever for this book to come out, when every gathering is sort of imbued with extra meaning, and navigating how to gather becomes like the most important thing when you can't actually see anyone. So I don't know. What do you think about the timing of this release?
It's ironic, and it's also, it's a fascinating moment to have the Art of Gathering particularly come at. I mean, the paperback came out like in the midst of the pandemic, and at a moment where the word gathering was in every headline, perhaps in a way that it's never been before. The CDC bans gatherings, right? California, yeah, Washington State bans gatherings of 10 or more people. Andrew Cuomo bans gatherings, and in a sense, the word gathering, and I chose it very intentionally. At like before COVID hit, was a source of meaning and inspiration and beauty, and kind of within 3 weeks, the context of the entire word flipped. And it was a source of danger and a source of death. And I think part of what has been beautiful and powerful and complicated and painful in this moment is that we still are grappling with and struggling with how to be together when we can't in the same old ways. How do we create meaning together despite significant obstacles? And, I'm a conflict resolution facilitator. So my core day job craft is not an events planner or a florist or a lighting expert or somebody whose profession is reliant on the things, right? The accoutrements of a gathering. It's really about like a facilitator is trained on how do you create meaningful connection despite significant obstacles. And a huge part of the Art of Gathering, well before COVID, when I was writing it, over the last many years, is about how do we actually stop our obsession on form and on things, and on the fish knives and the flowers and the AV equipment. How do we actually think about creating meaning, not through things, but through people? And right now we can't make meaning through things. And so it's become actually this like turned up volume on how do we actually create psychological togetherness and not over rely on the physical togetherness.
So how do you do it? I mean, I like you, like everybody, I am completely reliant on Zooms and FaceTimes, and trying to make time for that in life. But it's not the same. It's just there's something very much missing.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I hope and pray as much as everyone else that this period passes as fast as possible. And I think the way you do it is actually in some ways the same way you do it, whether you're physical or virtual, which is you start with the need in front of you. You start with the purpose. And so in some ways, the same way if you're thinking about a birthday party, I would say you don't start with the cake and the candles. In a Zoom meeting or in a Zoom staff meeting or in a Zoom birthday party, you don't start with Zoom. Like Zoom is a tool. It's not the host. And so, I'll give a specific example. I have a friend who was turning 50, and he thought about like, not what kind of party do I want, but like, what is my need right now? And he was feeling like tender about turning 50. And he'd never really cared about birthdays. He wasn't one to like worry about getting older, but he felt like a niggle, or I don't even know if that's the right word. He felt this thing about turning 50, and he kind of got clear on it. And he said, in my life, I have always been attracted to, and I've always sought out adventure and risk, and he was a foreign correspondent, and he realized that in his life, there were many people who, once they turned 50, they began to contract. They took less risks. They started taking less of the scary jobs. And he was really worried that would happen to him. And so he decided for his 50th, he would invite the people in his life that most continued to take risks. And he brought them together, and it was around a table, but you could do this on Zoom. And in the first 5 minutes, he raised his glass and he said, and he told the story and he said, what I most want is to continue to take risks and to expand. I don't want to be somebody who contracts slowly and incrementally over the next 20 years. I want to keep expanding. And you are people who have always kept expanding despite obstacles. And I want to thank you for that. And I want you to blow that energy to me when I begin to contract and remind me of tonight.
I love that. And even like in your book, when you talked about the dinner party and something as simple as like having a few couples for dinner and, oh, I'm having this couple, so I guess I should have this couple and da 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 da. What do you want to get out of a dinner party? Like, why are you going to do this? What do you want to talk about? Maybe you should talk about something really interesting. Maybe invite this other couple you hadn't even thought about and give it a whole new purpose. And everything just shifts. I mean, I think one of the biggest things is like we so often have meetings or events or whatever. And because we have them, they just are what they are. And your book and your whole message really is just like, no. Like we all have to stop. Yes, gatherings are part of life, but it doesn't have to be so like rote almost,
monotonous.
right? Yeah.
Totally. And like part of this is people, I think at first glance people are like, oh God, that's just so exhausting. I'm like, no, what's exhausting? Going through life on autopilot and like focusing on all the logistics and having everything to be perfect because you're trying to replicate somebody else's form. That's exhausting. You know what's life-giving? Having a real need and looking at yourself and saying, what is it that I need right now? And who might be able to help me with this? What is it that this community needs right now? And how might we actually design for that? I'll give an example. One of the characters in the book, Ida Benedetto, I called her up recently. She's the one, I don't know if you remember, she creates these kind of extreme experiences to help people navigate risk with care. So she does these like fake conventions at the Waldorf Astoria where people show up in black tie and have to do things like there's a wedding on the third floor, crash it and give a toast to the bride. Like things that just, make your palms sweat. And I called her up and I said, how are you thinking about the holidays? Like I always like when I kind of just need a different way of thinking, I call her and she said, if I could give any advice, I would say, don't think about a holiday party. How can you shift from a party to an adventure? And the difference between a party and an adventure is two things: motion and mission. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? She said, when I threw my 30th birthday party years ago, and many friends often say to me, it's like one of the best nights of their life. And I'm like, why? It was so simple. And she said, basically, she had a friend who was a photographer who was like taking pictures of beautiful like keyholes like on doors in the city. And she brought together like 12 friends and they all had to bring their camera. She explained their mission. The mission was to find the most beautiful keyholes in the city in 2 hours. And then they just went. And she said, what if during like the holidays, rather than trying to all like clamor into Zoom, and there's ways to make Zoom also meaningful, what if instead with your team or with your family, you created an adventure? You can be outside. It's cold, but when you're in motion, it's not so cold. When you have a mission, it allows you to move. Like, how do we actually think about being together in ways that are new experiences and don't have to look like what we think a party looks like?
It's like my kids going on field trips, right? It's like you have to get out of the classroom every so often and you have to go into the world and you kind of like roll your eyes and you're like, really, I have to like schlep to the Queen's Museum or something like that. And then you end up realizing that that's when you have the most memorable thing from the whole class, right? And you just have to push yourself to get out there because learning often doesn't happen the way you expect and neither does any of the rest.
And like that, the dynamics within the classroom, like all of us for good reasons play specific roles to have some amount of order, that whether it's assigned seats or whether Sally always sits by Sanjay and Sanjay always sits by Layla. And then on that sleepover, like everyone could pull their sleeping bags in the museum, like on different parts of the floor. And all of a sudden these new friendships were born. Like when we shift our spaces psychologically or virtually, we're also shifting our norms of like, who is labeled as what, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, but they're always the introvert, or like, they don't usually sing. And each of us have many parts. And so gatherings, I define a gathering as anytime 3 or more people come together for a purpose with a beginning, middle, or end. Like we're gathering all the time, but we're often gathering in ways that we're on autopilot and it's not serving anybody.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this all the time. So I was like particularly, I feel like, receptive to your message and your mission, because I'm always like analyzing time and how we're spending time and
Mm,
like, is this worth it? And even my own time, right? Like, is this
absolutely.
group Zoom worth it? Like, what is my purpose? Should I put it up? Should I be doing my emails at the same time during this one or that one? Or like, how do you maximize everything? And why are we even doing it? Right? Like,
Mhm.
what is
Yes.
the
Why are we?
point? Why are
Yes.
we doing it?
I
And
often
before,
say,
I used to do it with meetings. Like, what are we all just sitting around? Why do I go to board meetings? Like, what are we doing here?
and at some level, when it becomes performative, like, oh, well, I'd like to be on that board, or well, I like that company's mission, or well, whatever reason we each join boards or you join a board. And then at some level, like, no one really wants to be this like performative sitting duck. I'll give an example. A woman came up to me pre-COVID at a book event, and she said, "I'm an executive director. I read The Art of Gathering, and it helped me figure out why my board meetings suck. I realized that they are rubber stamps. And we all as a staff work to make sure we make our most beautiful presentations, and we go like a dog and pony show, and we show all the wonderful things that are happening, and everyone politely claps and leaves." And she said, "But these people on my board are brilliant, and I want to use them." And so I flipped my board purpose from being a dog and pony show to bringing them our scariest problems.
I love
Right?
that.
And everything changed, and it was specific and disputable. Some of her staff were like, "I don't know if this is such a good idea. You really want to tell them what the problems are?" But all of a sudden, like, you could see the blood come back into the board member's face. They were actually needed. Like, we should be gathering because we need each other,
Yes.
not out of obligation. And like, shifting it, every community has needs that benefit by people coming together. We're just not often gathering around what those needs are. And we shouldn't judge what those needs are. Like, the needs can be hilarious. They can be release. They can be like, I need to have a night where I can talk with other mothers and we don't talk about our kids, right? I need to remember that I can be many things.
Yes. I feel like I need to like try to put in motion. I'm on the board of like a major medical institution. I don't know how receptive they'd be if I'm like, okay, like, but then you think like, gosh, look at all the people sitting around this table. If we were all just talking to each other, how interesting would that be versus listening? Because I also feel like
Yes.
that's some way that we've all saved time. Like, I do feel like one perk of this pandemic, not that there are any, and not that I wouldn't trade it, obviously, but for times when you just need to listen and process, why go anywhere? Like, why run around town and go from here to there just to sit and listen if you can do it from your computer? But if you want to be with people and like bring yourself and your feelings, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm like preaching to the choir here, but I totally agree.
Absolutely. And I often say to my clients, people I work with, there's even in all types of institutions, there's a sense like we should have a retreat, or we should have a whatever, like a 3-day gathering. And I always say, like, why are you doing this? Why do you want to have a conference? What is your purpose? And then I say, if you want to invite all of these people, I want you to figure out like what the agenda is so that they would cancel other stuff to attend this.
And
Like, that's
also,
the bar.
and that usually like there has to be something they're getting out of it. Like you have to
Absolutely.
look at it as like marketing. Like, I have this anthology coming out and like we're trying to plan a tour, and I'm like, I've been on so many calls about books, right? Like, there has to be something that you're offering. Otherwise, why would anybody just sit and listen? Like, what can I give? And I don't know if I even have an answer to that, but I'm sort of like, what can I give that like people might leave and be like, oh, I'm so glad because now in my life I can do X, Y, or Z better, or something where it's not just
Yes.
like,
And not just receiving. So I think one like practical way to think about, almost like I think about time as like real estate. So if you have like 60 minutes on a Zoom call, 59 minutes of those shouldn't be a presentation, unless it's literally the most fascinating presentation in the world that people are like,
yes,
tearing walls down to get this data. That's not most people. Like, maybe it's the presidential's daily briefing, but if
maybe.
it's not that. And so how do you begin to shrink the presentation time to 30 minutes, or meaning over an hour, or 10 minutes, and create time for people to interact meaningfully? And on Zoom, that might mean breakout groups. It might be putting people into groups of 3. Like, it's not rocket science, but it's having the courage to not fill time. You know what else? Like, presentation also is de-risked. right? I know schools that are navigating enormous conflict, whether around COVID or teachers or just it's such a fraught time. And when like administrators come and finally do a Zoom call and you log in and it's a 59.5-minute presentation. Like they're not doing anything. They're perpetuating a problem because they're not actually shifting the relationship and listening to what people have to say. So how do you actually not just give people something, but how do you create a contract where the gathering is changed because of who the participants are and how they actually engage there? Like you can't create something new if it's just a stagnant like webinar.
Totally. You should just send the presentation ahead of time. Let me skim through it. I will digest the whole thing and I will come back to you in the meeting and then I will have my questions already thought through, and so will everyone else.
Exactly.
You know, that's like the beauty of like the brainstorm, right? You really do get lots more ideas when you all come together. But like if you're going to waste time just listening, it's, you know.
There's a facilitator named Misha Gluberman, and he wrote a book called The Chairs Are Where the People Go with Sheila Heti, like a few years ago. And I think it was in April, he wrote this sort of nerdy little medium piece that I loved. And it's nerdy because it shows you how to host a cocktail party on Zoom, but like through all of the technicalities. And he recently I have a newsletter community that like every 2 or 3 weeks we send out like a story of what somebody's, like how they're creating togetherness virtually. And every now and then we do an experience. And we brought Misha in and he showed us on Zoom how you can create basically an unconference like with 100 other people. And now Zoom has, when he wrote this piece in April, it was like kind of complicated, but now the latest version of Zoom has a feature where you can make everybody the host. So everybody, 100 people can be a co-host. And so this is an example of like, if you have 100 people or 30 people or 20 people, people are interesting. They know what their problems are. They know what their needs are. And so he created a Google Doc where he just said, do you have a conversation you would like to host in this group? Do you have a burning question you're trying to figure out? Some people were like, how do you fight online? Like, how do you have conflict safely virtually with your team? Other people were like, how do you create intimacy? Like all these different questions. And then everybody becomes a co-host on Zoom, and you can actually you see all the rooms, you see who's hosting the conversation, you see what the topic is on Google Docs, and you can literally like portal yourself, like the exit west, you can like go through the portal and like find yourself in another room. And it's a way of actually decentralizing power. It's putting the agenda into everybody's hands and letting people choose where they want to go. And it's not rocket science. It's actually helping people determine what the needs are and choose where they want to go. And people are now doing this virtually.
Wow, that's really neat. All right, so there's hope. There's hope for the Zoom world. Thank you for that. How did you know you wanted to be a conflict resolution expert? How did that happen?
I mean, I assume like your podcast, you are like trying to sort out your own life through this podcast.
What makes you say that? I can't believe you would jump to that conclusion. I'm offended.
So like same girl.
Yeah.
So I'm biracial, I'm bicultural. I grew up in a family that two parents were married and then divorced. And my mother's Indian, my father's white American, and then each remarried people who were in a lot of ways kind of polar opposite of the family that they had created together. And they had joint custody and I was part of both homes. And so every 2 weeks I'd go back and forth between these two homes. And it was like split screen or split reality. So one home was this Indian, British, Buddhist, meditating, incense-filled, dream interpreting, like World Banky, landmark forum-y home. And then I would travel 1.4 miles to my father and stepmother's home, and it was and still is a white American evangelical Christian, conservative, Republican, like meat-eating, softball playing, dogs, like just culturally a different place. And that was also my home. And so every 2 weeks I'd go back and forth between these two split screens and like in many ways, the things that each of those cultures, those family cultures began to think of as the other was actually my other 2 weeks. And so I've always been interested in like when and why and how we come together, and how we create our realities, and how we create group identity, and how can you create a group and an experience and a community where people feel something in common, feel connected to each other, but don't have to all be the same, where you're not stamping out people's differences in order to belong. In part because there's communities that I feel like I can belong and be complicated in, and there's communities where I don't feel like I can belong and be complicated in. And I'm really interested in the communities where you can belong and still have many paradoxes within you. But I'm also interested, I also don't think every community is for everybody. So like a big idea in the art of gathering is exclusion. Like you shouldn't invite everybody to everything. One, it makes everything the same, but also like it doesn't make sense for the purpose. So I'm a huge advocate in excluding people with care, and not because of their personality or because of the politics, but because of the purpose. So like, you know, I often talk about this gathering that a journalist hosted called the Worn Out Moms Hootenanny. And she was trying to create this dinner party. She felt obligated to do it. It was actually an assignment she had. And then she shifted and she said, you know what, a need I have is I'm worn out. I'm a mom. What if I host a dinner party for my other worn out moms? She called it a Worn Out Mom's Hootenanny. If they talked about their kids, they had to take a shot. And like the 6 women who were invited and like were so excited to be seen as worn out, to be seen as like a real need. And some of their partners were like, why can't dads come? And part of it is because that's not the need tonight. Right. And it begins to shift. It's like, if you want a worn out dad's hootenanny, you better be a little bit more worn out.
Yeah.
Right. Or like, it just starts to create specificity that actually has an opportunity to shift norms.
Very true. I know when I was reading about your childhood and the whiplash you must have had going back and forth. I'm a child of divorce too. And, you know, my parents lived very close together, and they're not as different as yours, but it's still like any child of divorce who has to navigate constantly, like having themselves in these 2 different environments, and, you know, having to adapt and also having to deal with parents in that situation. I feel like the conflict resolution, like schools or whatever, however you get trained, should pair up with the divorce lawyers, you know, and you could just like have a theater, you know, organization.
Completely. It's like a boot camp.
Yeah, boot camp. There you go.
Absolutely.
So for you personally, like now you have this book out, you're talking all the time on all these like shows and podcasts. You just talked to Brene Brown. Oh my gosh, I started listening, but now I have to finish after this. I was like, oh my gosh, you guys are amazing. So like what is it you still want to do? Like, what are you like super fired up to do next? And like, what now?
So I look at the people who I think have had some amount of like success, whatever you want to define that as, who are like in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and who are still happy and vibrant and seem grounded and not like jerks. And like what I see them doing and having in common, whether they're a comedian or whether they're like a therapist, is that they all are still connected to their source work. Mm-hmm. Right? It's the therapist who still sees clients 3 days a week. It's like Jerry Seinfeld still writes jokes every day. He still goes to like podunk pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID, like stand-up halls to try out new material, even though he's the most famous comedian in the world. Not because he's pursuing mastery, because he's close to source work. So for me, like for the rest of my life, I think I'm a facilitator. My craft and my source, like it's to be close to the work. And so in a sense, like I see writing as like this outcome of the questions I'm pursuing through groups. And then I think the second thing that has really helped me is years ago, David Brooks made a speech that resonated with me. And he said something like, no question worthy of pursuit is answerable in a lifetime. And so I like, how do we come together in ways that are meaningful and have a common agreed purpose and not have to all be exactly the same, like that's a 1,000-year question.
That's true. All right. So you got your work cut out for you.
And I think for each of us, like, rather than thinking about the form, again, it's like, how do you stay close to your source work, whatever that is? How do you continue to pursue mastery, whatever that may be in, right? It's like, Brene Brown, like, she has one of the best podcasts, like one of the best and most, like, whatever, #1 podcasts. She's relatively new at it. And she tweeted the other day, like, enjoyed so much listening to Dax Shepard and Tim Ferriss geek out on how to podcast. Like, she's a student, right? She's not sitting on her laurels. She's like, when she interviewed me, I was so moved. I was intimidated by the interview, like going in, like, oh gosh, what am I going to say? And she, more than anybody else I read, the entire interview is text-based. She like had her book, and it was The Art of Gathering. It was like dog-eared and posted all around, and like a student, and a student like with a capital S, she was studying. And it just reminded me, like, we all may have a mastery in one specific thing, but like, to continue to pursue a question is life-giving, not just to everyone else, but for yourself.
By the way, that does not make subsequent interviewers feel any good about what they are doing. I was reading this before I talked to you, and I was like, oh gosh, I've already failed this interview. Like, I already can't measure up. I'm
not at all. But I think part of the reason why even interviews for me are fun is because each one is an opportunity to have your brain collide with somebody else's brain, right? And so part of what's beautiful about your podcast is that it's like, it's your specific questions, it's your curiosities, not just for your audience, but for each author that comes on, that's unique and makes it like moms don't have the time to read Booksian or Zibbian, or, it's like, it's a very specific DNA.
This is just my opportunity to ask people what I want to know. I'm like delighted anybody else wants to listen, but this is completely self-serving. So
exactly,
yes.
Which is why it's relevant. It's like, you have a real need, you have a real, like, you're spending time, you found a way to spend time despite obstacles, which is, I imagine, being a mom and the things that like may come along with that. And there's a lot of other people who have the same problem. And so they get to ride alongside you.
Sure. Why not? Do you have any parting advice to aspiring authors?
Oh, to authors. Like, one is, think about a question that you don't know the answer to when you're writing a book. You may have an instinct around, you may think you have something to say, but you're really desperately curious to find out the answer to. That's one. Number two, don't write a book, write 12 chapters. Like, when I was thinking about a book, I was like, oh my God, this is so overwhelming. And my husband told me this, he's like, write down the 12 things you know are true, that are counterintuitive, that you believe might be like, and then go test them. And it was like, and my original yellow edge sheet of like 12 ideas, I think 6 of them became chapter titles, and 6 of them didn't, and new things came in. But write chapters, don't write a book. Make sure the chapters have an arc, but think about chapters. And then I think the third is, like, different authors and writers have different parts of the process that they love and that they hate. I love the research. I love the conversations. I love the meaning making. I hate the writing. And I find it very difficult. I'm a much better speaker than I am writer. So I found I would often like take voice memos of myself talking out loud and then transcribe myself onto the page. Like, you find ways to lean into what you love and then to hack through what you don't.
Excellent. Sounds like your husband could maybe be a writing coach on the side, if you guys need a little side hustle situation.
Yeah, exactly. He's very good.
Well, I would say let's meet up sometime, but of course I can't. So if we ever have a common goal that we need to sort out, we should maybe intentionally try to do that face to face at some point in the next 10 years or something.
I look forward to that. And I think I get so many of my examples. I mean, as you can hear from this conversation, from other people doing real stuff in the world. And so, send me your examples. Like, I often on Instagram, we're often having lively conversations about what people's holiday plans are, what Thanksgiving plans are, like what a virtual party looks like. And you can follow me at Priya Parker, sign up for our newsletter. The art of gathering is like a call to look at your own life and ask what the need is, and then gather around it. And it's a courageous thing to do, but it's also a contagious thing to do. And so a big part of the art of gathering is it's like a norm spreading, permission giving book.
Love it. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and for a project that you're pursuing that's, that other people get to benefit from.
No problem. Well, thanks for sharing.
Thanks so much, Zibby. Be
All
well.
right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.